Hello everybody, I'm Ted and welcome back to our lecture series, and this is going to be our final lecture on the civil rights movement of the mid-civil rights, the mid-20th century civil rights movement, sorry about that. And in our last lecture, I began our quick discussion on a few selected biographies on some of the major players, some of the key figures on the during the civil rights movement. We spoke of Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, or El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, has he changed his name to in the year before he died. In this lecture, we're going to continue going along. And the first selected biography is a name perhaps not a lot of people know, but she is one of my favorite leaders of the civil rights movement, a woman of indomitable spirit and capabilities. And she is Fannie Lou Hamer. And Hamer rose from humble origins as a sharecropper. She became a civil rights titan and a powerful grassroots organizer. She was instrumental in leading the fight to break segregation in Mississippi in the 1960s. Now, Hamer began her civil rights career by presiding over voter registration drives in Mississippi, an activity that cost her job. She was a sharecropper, and she was evicted from the farm where she had sharecropped. Now, having drawn the ire of the Mississippi segregationists, Hamer was one of the African Americans who was singled out for attack. And after one particularly brutal assault, she suffered permanent eye damage and permanent kidney damage. Now, undeterred, she continued her voter registration efforts, helping to organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. And during the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City later that year, her delegation was rejected in favor of the all-white Dixiecrat delegation. Now that delegation was opposed to desegregation, and though her delegation was rejected, Hamer was able to get the convention to ban racial discrimination in future conventions. So still a very remarkable accomplishment for her. And from moving on from Fannie Lou Hamer, we have Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, as he would change his name to in later life. And Carmichael was born in 1941 on the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean. And Carmichael rose to fame in the 1960s as one of the most influential and dynamic leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And Carmichael is best known for popularizing the dynamic phrase Black Power, and for his debate with George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party. And in an ironic twist, the Black Power phrase influenced the coining of the phrase white power. George Lincoln Rockwell admitted as much during their debate. It's a very interesting debate. Years ago, I remember watching it on YouTube. I haven't checked to see if it's still up there, but years ago I had the opportunity to see it, and it literally just blew me away. The conversation between a white nationalist and a black nationalist. By all accounts, it was a civil conversation, but it was still just amazing to behold. Now, Carmichael later left SNCC and joined the Black Panther Party, and this aroused a lot of controversy at the time. Carmichael would later leave the Republic, traveling the world as an exile, as an immigrant. And he did so to escape the watch of the FBI. And in 1948, he changed his name to Kwame Ture in honor of the former Ghanaian president Kwame Ture and the Kwame Nkrumah, I'm sorry, and the Guinean president Ahmed Sekou Touré. And from Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, we move on to Diane Nash, who is also one of the more prominent unsung heroes of the mid-20th century civil rights movement. Now, Nash was born on May 15th, 1938, and she was one of the more important African-American civil rights activists during the 1960s. She served as the leader and a strategist for the student wing of the civil rights movement. Now, Nash's desegregation campaigns were among the most successful of her era. Her efforts included the first successful civil rights campaign to integrate lunch counters in the city of Nashville, Tennessee. The Second Freedom Rides mission was traveled into the lower southeastern state to desegregate interstate travel accommodations and restaurants. She co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and co-initiated the Alabama Voting Rights Project and worked on the Selma Voting Rights Movement during that campaign. Her actions helped gain congressional passage for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which authorized the federal government to oversee and enforce state practices to ensure that African Americans and other minorities were not prevented from registering to vote. And from Diane Nash, we continue on with another powerful student activist, Huey Newton. And Huey Newton is best known as one of the founders and leaders of the Black Panther Party. Now, Huey P. Newton was born in Louisiana in 1942. He was the youngest in a family of 7, and when Newton was still young, his family moved to Oakland, where he grew up and attended school. Now, after high school, he attended Oakland's Merritt College, where he earned an associate's degree and spent a semester, at law school in San Francisco. Now, while he was studying law, Newton became involved in community activism as well as befriending Bobby Seale. And together they would go on to found the Black Panther Party in 1966 to take action on behalf of African Americans against societal oppression. Now, the affirming use of violence as self-defense was perhaps one of the most radical shifts in ideology. To sort of give a sort of a side-by-side comparison, a lot of the more conservative civil rights groups like the SCLC and SNCC at the time did not advocate responding with violence. They were pretty much non-violent. And while the NOI had the Fruits of Islam as a sort of paramilitary defense force, and while Malcolm X did always advocate fighting fire with fire, it wasn't until the Panthers that nationalists or separatists or Black Power activists really put that into play. The Panthers were known for dressing dramatically in black with their berets and their leather coats, and for coming armed with weapons, with rifles. They really took it to the self-defense to a next level. Now, in 1967, Newton was arrested for killing an Oakland police officer, and in response, the Black Panther Party and SNCC began the Free Huey campaign, and this campaign drew a national following. Newton pleaded not guilty, but was convicted on manslaughter charges in the trial. He appealed his conviction, which was overturned 2 years later, and Newton rejoined the Black Panther Party and sought to rejuvenate the party through community action and advocacy of non-violent political action. Now, Newton attracted trouble despite turning over a new leaf. He eventually fled. He was implicated in the murder of a young bar patron, and he fled to Cuba for 3 years to avoid being brought up on criminal charges. But Newton eventually returned to the United States in 1977 to focus on his education. He returned to school and he earned his bachelor's degree and a PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1980. However, tragically, in August of 1989, Newton was found dead on the streets of Oakland, the victim of a random shooting. Some people say, others speculate that it was some sort of nefarious criminal activity. But Newton himself was murdered right before the dawn of the 1990s. And lastly, we come to perhaps the most important, in my opinion, of these biographies, and that would be Emmett Till. Emmett Till was his murder, his lynching, is viewed as the catalyst for the entire mid 20th century. Like that moment, that moment, that 1955 in Money, Mississippi. It's viewed as the beginning phase of all-out activism. Had that rallying cry, had that rallying point that successfully motivated the entirety of the local African American communities in the Southeast uh, to fight to break segregation at all costs. And Till was born on July 25th, 1941. He was a 14-year-old African American boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, said she was offended by him in her family grocery store. The brutality of his murder and the fact that his killers were acquitted drew national attention and discomfort to the long history of violent persecution towards African Americans in the United States. Now, Till posthumously became one of the most enduring icons of the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century. He was from Chicago, Illinois, and he had been sent by his mother to visit relatives in the state of Mississippi. Now, before he left, his mother gave him instructions on how to behave in certain situations, owing to the legacy of Redeemer violence that reinforced Jim Crow segregation, namely how to behave when you encounter European Americans in Mississippi, what to say, what not to say, to not draw attention to yourself, things along those lines, and especially behavior regarding European American females in Mississippi. While shopping at a local store, Till was accused of whistling at a white woman, Carolyn Bryant. Now, Bryant informed her husband, Roy, who together with his brother, J.W. Milam, went out to Till's family's home and abducted him at gunpoint. He was taken to an old mill on the Tallahatchie River, where he was beaten by the men before being shot and discarded into the river. Now, Bryant and Milam were tried and acquitted for the murder by an all-white jury and later admitted to the killing of Till after they were acquitted. Towards the end of her life, Carolyn Bryant admitted that she made up the allegations against Till. And just to echo on what I said before, his murder was that rallying point for the African American community to really fight to resist. It was widely known. It was a de facto reality. It was reality that African American men were not safe. That they were seen as threats, and that periodically they would be beaten, shot, maimed, or just killed. The women weren't safe, to reinforce the fact that the men weren't men, and that the entire community was in this sort of second-class citizenship. But the murder of Till, the killing of Till, was the straw that broke the camel's back. He was a child, and it sent shockwaves through the community, a lightning rod, really. That something had to be done, because it wasn't just the adults who drew the ire of segregationists and white supremacists. It was now the children. They were targeting children now. Nobody was safe. So, yeah, that's the end of the biographies. The end of what I have to say on Till. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.